New Faces, New Friends by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 9. A Moment of Reckoning. Len and I stopped in at his folks' place on the way back from town. Ma Williams wasn't in the kitchen, which was unusual in the hour preceding dinner time. "Ma, where are you?" "I'm in here, Mabel. Come on in."
"What in the world are you doing in the parlor?"
Len began, when we noticed that they were not alone. A lady who looked to be in her 40s was perched on the edge of a chair facing the door. If I had not known better, I would have said that she was being scolded for something. Her expression was a curious mixture of guilt, alarm, and resignation.
"Len, Mabel, this is Mary Webster. She has come to apply for the school position," Paul Williams said. "Miss Webster, this is my son and daughter-in-law. Mabel had the school for 3 years.
Mary Webster looked at me and opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The color had drained from her face, and I feared she might fall off her chair. I walked over and took her hand. "How do you do? I'm pleased to meet you." She nodded her head. "Yes. Oh dear." "Is something the matter?" I asked anxiously. Are you feeling all right?" She nodded again. The children will never want me after having you." She appeared to be on the verge of tears. "Of course they will," I said. "They are all lovely children. I'm sure you wouldn't have any problem at all with them. Have you been teaching long?" 20 years. "Well, see," I said. "You have valuable experience. You should have seen me when I came here. I'd never taught a day in my life. You'll have nothing to worry about." If my attempt at reassurance eased her mind, it wasn't apparent to the naked eye. She fumbled with the handbag on her lap and glanced at the door as though making sure that a way of escape stood open. "Well, we should be leaving," I said to Len. As cheerfully as I could, I told Miss Mary Webster goodbye and that I hoped we would see her again soon. Back in the buggy, Len looked at me and laughed. I know, I said. "Don't judge anyone on first appearances, but Len, if a child says boo to that lady, she'll topple over in a faint. What in the world is she so terrified of?"
"Pa will find out," Len assured me. "If she isn't suitable, he won't hire her. She must have come with good references or he wouldn't be interviewing her. I don't think I've ever seen you look so bewildered."
"She was just so unexpected. I usually know what to say to people when I meet them, but I've never met anyone who looked as though her own shadow would scare her senseless." Later in the evening, Pa and Ma Williams came by to see us. I could hardly wait for the conversation to come around to the schoolteacher. Finally, Len broached the subject.
"Did you hire the lady, Pa?" "Yes, I did," he replied. "She has had 3 schools, and every one of her references said the same thing. I didn't think I'd better let her get away." "What did they say?" "They all said, 'The children love her.'"
"The children saw something I missed," I said to Sarah Jane when I told her about Mary Webster. "I've never laid eyes on a less likely candidate for a teacher."
"Mr. Williams' instincts were good when he hired you," Sarah Jane replied. "We'll hope they haven't failed him this time."
Len called a church society meeting to discuss the rebuilding ahead of us. Most of the congregation showed up, and not many of them refrained from expressing an opinion.
"I think,"
Frank Gage offered,
"that as long as we are building from the ground up, we'd better plan on a bigger church. It's true, we hadn't outgrown the old one, but there are more folks moving into town. I look for a substantial increase in attendance."
"That's just why we don't want a bigger church," Gladys Burton put in. "We don't need all the riffraff from the camps coming in." "Just what do you think the church is for, Gladys?" Augusta asked her. "Why, for maturing of the saints."
"Ain't no saints here to mature," her husband Zachary muttered. "Might as well close up and go home." "I think our ministry includes those who are seeking a better life," George Eliot spoke up. Any church that just takes care of its own is bound to die. The Bible says that Christ came not to be ministered to, but to minister. I don't think we should do any less." "That's good preaching, George," Kurt Matthews has said. "We talked some last winter about a bigger church, and now that we have to do something, we'd better look into it." "I agree with that," Peter Abbott said. "What I wonder is where we're going to get that kind of money." "The wisest thing to do is to get a loan from the bank. Then each of us give as we can each month to pay it off." Heads nodded at Jerome's suggestion. "I will donate the lumber from the mill, and we can do a lot of the work ourselves. The bank shouldn't have to carry a very large mortgage." Len and Jerome were appointed to visit Mr. Curtis the following day, and we left pleased with the outcome of the meeting. "At least some of us are pleased," Sarah Jane remarked as we watched Gladys Burton huff out of the school building. Her voice wafted back at us.
"You know I can't sit on those school seats every week. All they ever think about is the strangers coming into town. What about us that's been here all our lives? Don't we count for anything?"
"The church didn't fall down on purpose to spite you, Gladys," Zachary replied. "Be thankful we have somewhere to worship until it's rebuilt." When Len returned the next day from the bank, I knew at once that all was not well. He sat down at the table and sighed deeply.
"What is it, Len? Did you get the loan?"
"Well," he said, "when Jerome and I went in, Mr. Curtis seemed very pleased. But when we broached the subject of a mortgage, he became quite uncomfortable. 'I'm sorry, gentlemen, but the bank is rather low on funds at the moment. I'm afraid I can't manage anything like that amount.' I guess he knew we were shocked because he went on in a hurry before either of us could speak. 'I know we are holding a mortgage on the Greenwood church where my son is, but the fact is,' Jerome interrupted him, "that you are loaning money for new farms in the area. There is more than this to the lack of funds." Then Mr. Curtis really began to squirm in his chair. Len continued. "I hoped we wouldn't need to get into it, but you aren't going to let it drop, are you?" "Certainly not," Jerome replied. "Well, the fact is that there have been some disturbing rumors about town concerning the minister's wife. I'm of the opinion that a man who cannot take care of his own household is not qualified to be responsible for a church." "You have biblical backing for that opinion, Mr. Curtis," I said, "but I wasn't aware that I hadn't been caring for my household." "Nor was I," Jerome said. "Would you mind telling us what those rumors are and where they came from?" "I was appraised of them by my son. Perhaps you'd better consult him on the matter." "You may be sure that we will," Jerome said, "and you will be hearing from us again." "We got up and left and came right home," Len concluded. "I suppose I'll have to go and talk to Hudson. Jerome offered to handle it, but I told him to let me see what I could find out first." I couldn't recall ever being so angry in my life. I jumped to my feet and snatched my sunbonnet from the nail.
"No, you won't," I declared. "This whole thing is my fault, and I'll see Hudson about it, Len. I've told you everything I've said to Hudson, and you know about every time I've seen him. There must be a few things that neither one of us knew, and I intend to find out what they are."
I was afraid he would forbid me to go, but after a moment he said, "All right, Mabel, perhaps you're right. If you can straighten things out, I'll talk with him." Len hitched Regal to the buggy, and I departed for Greenwood, with my fighting clothes on, as Ma used to say when one of us was spoiling for an argument. It was a wretched-looking Hudson who tried to explain. "You remember the day I saw Colleen and thought it was you?" I nodded. "I knew right away that she was the girl I wanted to marry. When you offered to introduce her to me, I was sure it was the Lord's will. Everything would have been fine if I could have kept my folks in my church from learning that she had worked in a saloon."
"You should have known better," I told him. "Besides, when you saw what a state your mother was in, why didn't you just give it up?"
"I couldn't do that. That's when the idea came to me. If I let people think that you had some problems that I was helping you with,
No one would wonder why I was spending so much time in North Branch.
I had problems, I exploded. You let people think I had problems? Hudson, you're worse than Gladys Burton. How could you even think of such a thing?
I know. Hudson looked remorseful. It was really a terrible thing to do. But since you and Colleen look so much alike, I figured if anyone saw me with her, they'd probably think it was you. That way I could get acquainted with her, and when she said she would marry me, she would be out of that tavern and everything would be fine. I don't know where it all went wrong.
I'll tell you where it went wrong, I snapped. Your first mistake was including me in your scheme. What did you think would happen to my reputation?
Hudson looked surprised. Why, no one would ever think anything bad about you. People aren't going to gossip about the preacher's wife.
You have a lot to learn, Hudson, I said grimly. The preacher's wife is the first one they pounce on. I hate to be the one to disillusion you, but there are people in this town who are convinced that I'm the one you came to see.
I eyed him sharply.
I'll have to say that you didn't do a whole lot to make them think differently. You didn't call on Colleen at all, did you?
Well, not really. I lost my nerve. I spoke to her whenever I saw her, but I didn't ask her to go out with me. I was afraid she'd turn me down, and I was afraid she wouldn't. Either way, I wouldn't have known what to do. So the only excuse I had for continuing to come over here and see her was you. I had to sort of let people think you might be having some difficulty with Len and needed my advice.
Hudson Curtis, I can't believe you. Is that why your father said what he did to Len? How could you do such a thing?
Hudson looked thoroughly miserable. I'm sorry, Mabel. I didn't mean to get you into trouble. I really didn't. I feel terrible about that.
You're not alone there,
I sighed.
What I'd like to know is why didn't you come and tell me all of this when you saw how things were going?
I tried to tell you, Mabel, but you never had time enough to listen.
When did you try? I demanded. It seems to me I've done a lot of listening to you, Hudson.
Well, the night of the strawberry social, I decided I'd let you know that I was afraid Colleen wasn't interested in me and confess what I'd been doing, but you had cake to cut or something. Then I came out to your house the evening Augusta Harris was there, and I didn't have the courage to come in. Another time you were in town, but Sarah Jane was with you. Then I followed you clear out to the fair, and you couldn't leave your friends. What was I to do?
You certainly didn't have any trouble figuring out what to do when you hatched the whole scheme, I told him. You've put both Colleen and me in a terrible spot. Haven't you lived in a small town long enough to know what people do with a situation like this?
I just didn't think it through, he said. Of course, we didn't know about the tornado either. If that hadn't happened, this whole thing would probably have blown over. A grin spread across his face as he considered the cleverness of his pun. I glared at him and he wiped it off quickly.
Well, it didn't blow over. Now, are you going to straighten things out with your father so that Len can get a loan to rebuild the church?
I can't tell my father what a fool I've been, Hudson replied dismally. He thought I'd forgotten all about Colleen after the night of your party. Anyway, I didn't exactly tell him that you and Len were having problems. He sort of assumed it. And I didn't tell him differently. Maybe you could go and explain what happened. If the blunt instrument that Sarah Jane mentioned had been at hand, I probably would have used it at that moment.
Hudson, I am going to pretend that you didn't say that. This is your responsibility, and it's time for you to buck up and face it. If you don't, Len is going to have to leave his church. Do you want that on your conscience?
All right, Mabel, I'll do what I can. I hope that you'll pray for me. Hudson was pale and shaken when he left to head for the bank. I had to admit that I wasn't in much better shape than he was. I had to share this horrid development with Len. End of chapter 9.